I was sipping lukewarm coffee when the message appeared. My phone buzzed across the desk screen, lighting up with the familiar family group chat Heart Family. I almost ignored it. I'd been getting better at pretending. Then the words slid down the screen, casual and final hope she doesn't come to her sister's wedding. For a second I thought I'd read it wrong. I waited for an edit a laugh emoji, anything that could soften it. Nothing came. Just silence. My mother's name hovered above the text like a verdict. No one replied. Not my father, not Grace. They didn't even delete it. They'd simply forgotten I was still in the group. I stared until my reflection blurred on the screen, the message glowing faintly against the gray light of Portland's rain. I didn't reply. I didn't ask why. I just pressed the side button and let the screen go dark. Maybe silence would speak louder than I ever could. Outside, the drizzle tapped against the window of my small studio, soft and persistent, like it was trying to fill the space where words used to be. The air smelled like damp wood and old coffee grounds. On the monitor in front of me, a smiling couple stood under fairy lights, hands entwined, a perfect frame from someone else's love story. I moved the cursor, absently adjusting exposure, sharpening details, pretending to care. My work had always been about capturing connection, two people, finding each other, holding still long enough for joy to be proof. But at that moment, every photo felt like a lie. Another buzz. I didn't have to look. More pictures from Mom, no doubt, ribbon samples, flower arrangements, a photo of Grace in her white robe at the bridal suite. She'd always been the kind of beautiful people wrote songs about, delicate, luminous, the kind of daughter who looked good in family portraits. The kind of daughter my mother could brag about. She deserves the perfect day, Mom's caption read under the photo. My chest tightened. I could almost hear her voice, that soft clipped tone she used when she corrected me as a teenager. Don't be so loud, Olivia. You take up too much space. I leaned back in my chair, letting the hum of my computer fill the silence. A framed photograph hung on the wall beside me, a lavender field in Provence, the one I'd taken last summer on assignment. The colors had faded a little, but the light still shimmered in that quiet, endless way I loved. That trip had been the last time I felt like myself. No expectations, no family drama, no invisible rules about how to exist. Just air warmth and the sound of cicadas echoing through the valley. I thought about that place now, and how far away it felt from this damp little studio. My phone buzzed again. This time I looked. Another message in the chat. My dad's simple thumbs up emoji, followed by Grace's picture of champagne glasses. A celebration I'd never be part of. I felt a small laugh escape me, sharp, almost cruel. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was recognition. They'd been erasing me for years. This was just the confirmation. The text was only a line in a much longer story, one that started with comparisons whispered over dinner tables and birthdays, spent watching Grace unwrap gifts while mine were forgotten in the corner. My mother had mastered the art of favoritism disguised as tradition. I stood stretching the stiffness from my shoulders and walked toward the window. The city looked muted, all slate rooftops and puddles reflecting blurred headlights. A man with an umbrella crossed the street below, disappearing into the mist. Somewhere, a horn sounded distant, indifferent. Portland could be cruel in its grayness. It had a way of matching your mood until you couldn't tell if the sadness belonged to you or the sky. I reached for my camera on the table, its cold metal grounding me. Through the lens, the window transformed into a canvas, droplets of rain tracing lines like veins of light. I adjusted the focus and clicked the shutter. The sound broke the silence, sharp and satisfying. A photograph of nothing and everything. Proof that I still existed, even if my family wished I didn't show up in their frame. I set the camera down and stared at my reflection in the dark glass. I didn't look angry. I looked tired. The kind of tired that settles in your bones, not from work, but from being misunderstood for too long. My mother would have said I was dramatic. Grace would have said I was sensitive. My father would have said nothing at all. That was our family dynamic. In a sentence, loud judgment, quiet compliance, and me caught in the middle, waiting for a space that was never mine. The studio clock ticked softly. I imagined the wedding preparations happening without me, fittings, tastings, rehearsals. My mother directing every moment like a conductor, ensuring perfection while pretending not to notice who was missing. Maybe she'd tell people I was traveling for work, that I was too busy with my photography. Maybe she'd say it wasn't personal. It never was, according to her. Just practical. I poured myself another cup of coffee, though it had already gone cold. The bitterness filled my mouth, grounding me more than it should. I opened my laptop again, but didn't click anything. My inbox overflowed with deadlines and drafts, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept circling back to that single text. Hope she doesn't come. The words played in a loop until they lost shape, turning into rhythm like rain on the roof. I wondered if Grace had seen it. If she'd read it, and stayed silent too. Probably. She'd always been good at keeping peace, even if it meant standing by while someone else burned. Maybe she thought I'd understand. Maybe she thought I'd already expected it. Maybe she was right. For a long time, I just sat there, the city's low hum seeping through the window. I thought about replying, about typing something scathing or simple, like, "Don't worry, I won't." But what was the point? They'd already spoken. The only language they knew, silence disguised as civility. I could either keep translating it or finally learn a new one. I walked across the room to the shelf by the door. There, tucked between photo albums and old lenses, was a postcard I'd kept from Provence. The image showed an old villa on a hill bathed in gold light. On the back, I'd once scribbled a note to myself. Remember how it felt to breathe. My thumb brushed over the words, faint now but still legible. I thought about that light, the smell of lavender, the hum of the world when no one was telling me who to be. Maybe it wasn't too late to go back. The rain softened outside, turning into a mist. I opened the window, letting the damp air touch my face. Somewhere down the street, a church bell rang faintly, its echo stretching through the gray. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills every hollow space inside you. For the first time all day, I didn't feel small. I felt deliberate, like every quiet second was building towards something I couldn't yet name. I turned off the lights in the studio, the room dissolving into soft shadows. The reflection of the streetlights shimmered across the wet floor, streaks of gold and silver weaving together. I picked up my phone one last time, opened the chat, scrolled to the message, and stared at it again. My mother's words, so simple, so final. Hope she doesn't come. I whispered to the dark. You've already made sure of that. Then quieter, almost to myself, but you'll see me anyway. The rain started again, gentle, steady, relentless, as if the city itself was promising to remember what they'd tried to forget. The morning after the message, the city looked washed out, as if Portland itself had been drained of color overnight. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table I'd used to edit thousands of photos, staring at the phone that hadn't stopped vibrating since dawn. It wasn't new messages, just the same one replaying in my head over and over again. Hope she doesn't come to her sister's wedding. The words looked harmless when stripped of tone, but I could still hear the coldness behind them. My mother never needed exclamation marks to wound. I thought about deleting the chat. Instead, I opened it, took a screenshot, and saved it in a folder labeled Truth. A small act of preservation, maybe even revenge, though it didn't feel satisfying. It felt like keeping proof of something no one would believe. The screen's glow caught on the edge of a framed photo nearby, Grace, at 16, smiling under summer sunlight. Mom had taken that one. It was always Grace. In the frame, Grace, at the center, Grace. Getting it right. I had learned early that I was the shadow, the background blur. Rain still clung to the windows, tiny silver beads trembling in the wind. I picked up my camera and looked through the lens at the empty street outside. A man walked his dog in a yellow raincoat, the leash swinging loosely between them. The simplicity of it calmed me. Ordinary people, ordinary love. My kind of peace. But the silence in my apartment felt too large. It pressed against my chest, heavy, deliberate. For most of my life I'd feared silence. It was how my family punished. No yelling, no explanations, just the sudden absence of sound. My mother's favorite sentence was nothing at all. I used to fill that space with apologies I didn't owe. I set the camera down and poured myself coffee gone cold. My phone buzzed again, an old client asking about edits. Another about a potential collaboration. I typed a polite response, then stopped halfway through, staring at my reflection in the dark screen. Who was I trying to impress now? The world felt smaller after last night, and I didn't want to perform anymore. The sound of a notification pulled me back. This time it wasn't work. It was from my father. Just 3 words, call your mother. No period, no explanation. I laughed, quiet and bitter. The message could have been a recording from any year of my life. Dad never asked how I was. He just asked me to maintain the peace. I didn't call. Instead, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The rain had softened to a mist floating in the air like breath. The smell of wet pavement and coffee from the cafe below wrapped around me. I walked toward the waterfront, camera slung over my shoulder. The city was waking up, cars splashing through puddles, gulls crying over the harbor. I lifted the camera and started shooting without thinking. Reflections in puddles, raindrops sliding down a cafe window, a woman holding her kid's hand under a too small umbrella. Every photo felt like proof that life continued, indifferent to heartbreak. People think silence means peace. But when you grow up in a house where silence is punishment, peace feels suspicious. I'd spent years waiting for someone to fill the quiet with love. Now I realized maybe I was supposed to fill it myself. Back at my studio, I set the camera on the table and scrolled through the photos. The shots were moody, gray, imperfect, but they looked alive. I almost smiled. Then my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated, then answered. Hey, his voice came low and familiar with the faint hum of Los Angeles traffic behind him. You sound tired. I'm fine, I lied. He chuckled softly. You're a terrible liar, Liv. Everything okay up there? I sighed, leaning back in my chair. My family just reminded me I'm still the outsider. Same song, different verse. What happened? My mom sent a text in the family chat. Said she hopes I won't show up to Grace's wedding. A silence stretched between us. Then Ethan muttered, Jesus, Liv. Yeah. She probably forgot I was still in the group, he exhaled. You always think it's about you being too much. But maybe they just can't handle someone who doesn't fit their frame. I laughed, but it came out sharp. Easy for you to say. You have parents who actually talk to you. He didn't argue. Ethan never argued when I got defensive. He just waited me out. Finally, he said, you could come here, you know. We could find you work. I'm shooting for a small doc project next month. I shook my head, though he couldn't see. I can't run away from them forever. Who said it's running? Maybe it's redirecting. His words lingered even after the call ended. Redirecting. Not escaping. I repeated it under my breath until it started to sound less like guilt and more like permission. That night I couldn't sleep. The studio was too quiet. I turned on a single lamp, golden light spilling across the walls. I walked to the mirror and stared at myself. The same face my mother always called expressive, which was her polite way of saying emotional. My eyes looked tired, yes, but they also looked awake in a new way. I set up my tripod, placed the camera opposite the mirror, and pressed the timer. Click. The shutter echoed softly through the room. I took another, then another, until the memory card was full. When I reviewed them, I didn't look polished. My hair was messy, mascara faint under my eye, skin uneven. But I looked real. For the first time, I wasn't chasing perfection or warmth or approval. I was documenting existence, proof that I hadn't disappeared. I named the folder, starting over. The next morning, sunlight pierced through the clouds for the first time all week. The city still dripped from the rain, streets glistening like wet glass. I made fresh coffee and opened my laptop. The usual flood of emails waited, clients, deadlines, invoices. But one caught my eye, an open call for photographers at a creative residency in southern France. The name made me pause. Lavender Studio Provence. Provence. The word carried scent and color, even on a gray screen, fields of purple stretching under sunlight, the place I'd photographed once and never forgotten. I clicked the link. They were looking for artists exploring themes of silence and rebirth. My throat tightened. It felt like the description had been written for me. I scrolled to the bottom, cursor hovering over apply. My heart beat fast. I heard Ethan's voice again, redirect, not escape. I opened a blank document and started typing, application for residency. Lavender Studio Provence. In the box labeled, reason for applying, I wrote, because I need to see what peace looks like in the light. I stared at the sentence for a long time before pressing send. The email whooshed away, leaving a strange quiet behind. Not the kind that hurt, but the kind that promised something. I looked out the window. Rain still clung to the rooftops, but sunlight was starting to push through, casting thin gold lines across the city. I picked up my camera and raised it toward the light. The lens fogged slightly, then cleared. For the first time, I didn't flinch at the silence. I embraced it. Maybe silence wasn't what my family had used to control me. Maybe it could become my way out. That night, I sat on the couch with my legs tucked under a blanket, scrolling through the photos from my self-portrait session. The last one stopped me a frame where I wasn't posing, just breathing. My expression soft, almost at peace. I saved it as independence.jpg. Then I closed the laptop, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark with only the city's distant hum for company. Outside, a car passed, headlights slicing through mist. The rain had stopped completely. For the first time in months, I felt the stillness settle around me like something gentle. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like beginning. The confirmation email arrived 2 weeks later, buried between invoices and promotional spam. I almost deleted it before I noticed the subject line. Congratulations, Lavender Studio Residency Provence. My breath caught mid-sip of coffee. I read it once, then again, as if the words might dissolve if I blinked too fast. Accepted. They wanted me there by mid-March. Accommodations provided a studio overlooking the lavender fields. For a long time, I just sat there, the steam from my mug fading into the air. This wasn't just a trip. It was an escape disguised as an opportunity. I could almost hear my mother's voice, already sharp and disbelieving. France, again. Don't you ever get tired of running away? But this time, I didn't care what she thought. I wasn't running. I was answering something I couldn't ignore anymore, the quiet part of me that wanted to breathe somewhere. No one remembered my silence. I called Ethan that afternoon. You're not going to believe this, I said. He sounded distracted at first, probably editing footage, but the second I told him, his tone shifted. Liv, that's incredible. You're really doing it. I guess I am, I said, a small laugh slipping out. I leave in 2 weeks. You know what that means, right? That I have to find my passport, he chuckled. That you get to start over. His words settled deep inside me. Start over. I'd heard that phrase 100 times in motivational podcasts, but this time, it didn't sound like a cliché. It sounded like a door creaking open. For the next days, I packed in pieces, sorting through the clutter of my life, deciding what deserved to come with me. Hard drives full of weddings I'd shot, notebooks of half-written thoughts, and one box labeled family. Inside were photos from childhood, Grace and me, in matching Christmas sweaters. Mom arranging our hair into perfect curls, Dad laughing behind the camera. For a second, I almost kept them. Then I stopped. I pulled one photo out, Grace and me on the beach, at 9, our feet buried in the sand, salt wind pushing our hair back. She had her arm around me, eyes squinting at the sundae. I slipped that single photo into my suitcase, left the rest behind, and closed the box. The night before my flight, Mom called. I stared at the screen until it went dark. She left a voicemail, her tone clipped and polite, the kind she used when talking to neighbors. I heard you're traveling again. Be careful, Olivia. Remember, running doesn't fix what's broken. I deleted the message. At the airport, everything felt strangely calm. The sound of rolling suitcases, the smell of burnt coffee, the low hum of announcements, they blended into a white noise that numbed thought. I handed over my passport and watched the agent stamp it without looking up. One simple thud and I was cleared to leave behind everything that had tried to define me. On the plane, I stared out the window as the clouds swallowed the city. Portland shrank beneath me, the bridges, the gray river, the skyline fading like an old photograph. I thought about Grace somewhere in Florida, probably picking floral arrangements with Mom for her big day. I imagined her laughing softly, probably saying something like, "I just want everything perfect." Maybe she'd look at her phone and pause, noticing my absence. Maybe not. By the time the plane landed in Paris, my body was heavy with exhaustion, but my mind buzzed. The connecting flight to Marseille was delayed, so I sat by the terminal window watching people rush by, families, couples, businessmen, all heading somewhere, all carrying pieces of their lives in rolling luggage. I realized mine was the lightest bag in the room. When I finally stepped out of the tiny regional plane into the bright Provençal air, the difference was immediate. The light was softer, thicker, golden, even in late afternoon. It clung to the hills, painting the rooftops with warmth. The air smelled faintly of thyme and old stone. A driver from the residency held a sign with my name, his accent rich and melodic. "Bienvenue à Provence, Mademoiselle Hart," he said with a smile. For the first time in months, I smiled back without forcing it. The drive from the airport wound through narrow roads lined with cypress trees and vineyards still bare from winter. As we climbed a small hill, the driver gestured toward the horizon. "That's Valençol. The lavender comes alive there in June. You'll see its magic." When the villa came into view, my chest tightened. It looked like something from another time: pale stone walls, green shutters, terracotta roof. A weathered sign by the gate read Atelier Lumière. Sunlight spilled across the courtyard, where two women were hanging linens to dry, their laughter echoing through the open air. Inside, the manager, an older man named Mr. Moreau, greeted me with the easy warmth of someone who'd seen hundreds of artists arrive lost and leave whole. "Welcome, Olivia," he said, shaking my hand. "You are the photographer from Portland, yes? The one who captures quiet." I blinked. "Quiet," he smiled. "Your portfolio. That's how we described it. You make silence look alive." The compliment hit deeper than I expected. I'd spent years trying to silence myself. Now it was something I apparently captured. He led me through the corridors, explaining the history of the villa, once a monastery, then an artist commune. "The walls remember," he said softly. "They know how to listen." My studio was at the end of a long hallway overlooking the valley. When I opened the window, the late light poured in, honey-colored, endless. I could hear distant bells from a church and the soft hum of the wind. I stood there for a while, hands resting on the sill, breathing in air that didn't taste like rain. For the first time since reading that message, my body didn't feel tight with defense. That night I unpacked slowly. Camera, lenses, notebooks. I set Grace's beach photo on the desk beside a small vase I found near the window. The room was quiet except for cicadas singing outside. I made tea and stepped out onto the terrace. Below, the village lights glimmered like scattered stars. I thought about how silence here didn't sting. It hummed. The next morning, the residency officially began. Artists gathered in the courtyard, painters, writers, sculptors, all strangers with the same hunger in their eyes. Over breakfast, a sculptor from Spain asked what I planned to work on. "Something about silence," I said before I could stop myself. "And what it costs." He nodded thoughtfully. "Then Provence will give you everything you need. The light here forgives everyone." Later, Mr. Moreau showed me the darkroom and the garden beyond. "You'll find your peace here," he said, handing me a small brass key. "But be patient. Peace is shy." Days began to fold into rhythm. Morning light tea, long walks through the fields. I photographed the village baker kneading dough, the cracks on old shutters, the faces of market vendors laughing over wine. At night, I edited photos until my eyes blurred. Each day, the ache inside me softened a little more. The noise of my family's expectations receded like a tide going out. I started writing again, not for clients, not for work, just for myself. Short sentences. Fragments of truth. Maybe silence isn't punishment. Maybe it's preparation. One evening, Mr. Moreau invited me to join him on the terrace. He poured wine deep red that smelled of earth and sunlight. "You know," he said, looking out at the horizon, "we all come here for the same reason, to forgive something." I stared at the fading sun, the sky melting from gold to violet. "What if I'm not ready to forgive yet?" He smiled gently. "Then photograph what it feels like not to be ready." The wind rustled through the lavender fields, whispering something I couldn't quite hear. Later that night, alone in the studio, I took out my camera and aimed it toward the mirror. The reflection was softer this time. The exhaustion had lifted, replaced by something quieter. Not joy, not yet, but curiosity. I pressed the shutter. The click echoed in the still air, followed by a sound I hadn't made in a long time, a laugh low and real. I uploaded the photo immediately and titled it, "Becoming." The next morning, as sunlight spilled across the floor, I realized something simple, but certain: I hadn't come here to escape them. I'd come here to find me. The first storm of March rolled in quietly, the kind that announced itself not with thunder but with wind whispering against the shutters. I woke to the smell of wet earth and the steady rhythm of rain tapping the glass. Provence looked softer under gray skies, as if someone had draped the valley in gauze. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the lavender fields sway, stripped bare, but still stubbornly beautiful. By now, I had been here nearly a month. My body had learned the rhythm of this place. The early bells, the market chatter, the way light shifted between morning and dusk. The noise of my old life felt like something that had belonged to someone else. I worked until my fingers ached, taking photos of everything that breathed a child, chasing pigeons in the square, the ripple of linen curtains, the outline of raindrops on glass. Somehow every image seemed to say what I couldn't. But that morning, for the first time since I arrived, I opened my inbox. The Wi-Fi in the villa was spotty, and I'd used that as an excuse to stay disconnected. I scrolled past newsletters and junk until one subject line stopped me. Grace's wedding updates. It was from my mother. I froze. It wasn't sent directly to me, just the family group thread I'd never left. I must have still been included in oversight she hadn't corrected. Against every instinct, I clicked it open. Photos flooded the screen. My sister in a boutique, her smile, glowing the kind of happiness that photographs loved. Mom's caption read, "Final fitting, our girl looks radiant." Beneath that, a string of hearts from Dad. Another message followed minutes later, "Can't believe it's only 6 weeks away." The ache hit instantly, a dull pressure behind my ribs. I stared at the pictures until my eyes blurred. Grace's dress shimmered in soft white silk, the same shade Mom had always said washed me out. Her hair framed her face in perfect curls. Hers, not mine, always just right. I could almost hear the conversation, "See, Grace, simple elegance suits you. Not like your sister, she always tries too hard." The old anger flickered sharp and fast. But it didn't stay. What replaced it was quieter grief, maybe. Grief for a family that had never been big enough for both of us. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms against my eyes. Outside, the rain thickened, pattering harder against the window. I breathed in slow, counting the beats. One for anger, one for hurt, one for letting go. A knock at the door startled me. "Come in," I called, expecting Mr. Moreau or one of the other residents. But it was a voice I hadn't heard in months. "Am I interrupting?" Ethan leaned against the doorframe, hair damp from the rain camera bag slung over his shoulder. I blinked. "You're early," he smiled. "Surprise." "The film shoot wrapped sooner than expected. Figured you wouldn't mind a guest." I laughed, shaking my head. "You just can't stay away from gloomy weather, can you?" "Only when it's you in the frame," he said lightly, stepping inside. He dropped his bag near the wall and scanned the studio. Prints were scattered everywhere, pinned to corkboards, taped to the windows, stacked in uneven piles. "You've been busy," he said, picking up one. "Trying to be," I replied. "The quiet helps." He studied the photo, an old woman's hands, weaving lavender stems together. "You're not hiding behind color anymore," he said. "This feels raw." I looked away. Maybe that's all I have left to give. He didn't push. He never did. Instead, he poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. So he said finally, "Any word from home?" I hesitated. "They're planning the wedding." He nodded, reading between the lines. "And they look happy." "And you?" "I'm working on it." He smiled faintly. "You don't owe anyone an explanation for your peace, Liv." The simplicity of it caught me off guard. My throat tightened. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," he said softly. "But it's worth it." We spent the afternoon in silence, him reviewing footage, me editing photos. The rain softened to a drizzle, leaving behind the scent of wet lavender. Every so often I'd catch him glancing at me like he wanted to say something but didn't. By sunset, the clouds broke open, letting in streaks of gold. I walked outside, camera in hand. The air was heavy with moisture, but the sky looked like it was glowing from within. Ethan followed, his hands in his pockets. "You always chase the light," he said. "It's the only thing that doesn't lie," I replied. I raised the camera, focusing on the horizon where sunlight touched the wet fields. Then I turned it toward him. He laughed. "Don't. I'm not dressed for your moody masterpiece." "Hold still," I said, smiling despite myself. He froze, half laughing, half curious, and I clicked the shutter. The image appeared instantly on the preview screen, his outline backlit by gold raindrops suspended mid-air. "Honest, unpolished, real. That's you," I said quietly. The calm after the storm. He walked closer, eyes soft. "And what about you?" "I'm still learning to stop apologizing for the rain." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind brushed past, carrying the smell of earth and salt. Then he said, "You know there's a photography grant coming up. They're featuring artists working on identity. You should apply." I shook my head. "I can't. They'd never pick someone like me." "You mean someone who doesn't smile through pain?" I exhaled. "Someone who's still figuring out what the truth looks like." He tilted his head. "Then show them that. That's the truth they'll remember." When he left that evening, the sky had turned violet. I watched his car disappear down the winding road until the taillights blurred into distance. Back inside, I sat at the desk and pulled up my photos. Among them, I found the one I'd taken moments before he arrived, Grace in her wedding dress. I stared at it, then dragged it into a new folder labeled Untold Stories. I opened a blank page in my notebook and wrote, "Pain looks different in every light. Mine just happens to bloom where silence grows." The next day, Mr. Moreau stopped by the studio. He carried a newspaper under his arm and a basket of figs in the other. "For inspiration," he said. He placed the paper on my table. The headline caught my eye: "Lavender Studio to host International Exhibit May 21. Every resident will display one piece," he explained. "We call it the Evening of Light. It's our tradition." May 21. The date landed in my chest like a drop of ice. That's... I stopped myself before finishing. "Grace's wedding day." He smiled, unaware. "A good omen, non?" I forced a nod. "Yes, perfect." After he left, I stared at the date printed on the page until the ink blurred. The storm outside had cleared completely, leaving behind a pale stillness. I walked to the window, the fields stretching endlessly, washed clean by rain. Maybe fate had a cruel sense of humor, or maybe it was offering me symmetry, a chance to rewrite what that day meant. I lifted my camera again, aimed it at the sunlight pooling on the floor, and whispered, "This time, I'll be the one who shows up." The shutter clicked once, the sound small but certain, like a promise. The morning sun fell through the shutters in thin stripes, warm against the sheets. I woke earlier than usual, the kind of restlessness that arrives when life feels like it's shifting underneath you. Downstairs, the villa was quiet, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. I made coffee and stepped out into the courtyard. The stones were still cool under my bare feet, the world bathed in soft gold. Provence always seemed to move slower after rain, as if the earth itself were taking a breath. I sat at the small iron table by the fountain, sketchbook open, camera beside me. The headline from yesterday's newspaper, the May 21st exhibit, lingered in my mind. That date felt too familiar, too precise. The same day Grace would walk down an aisle in Florida, flanked by our parents smiling for 1,000 photos I would never be in. The symmetry of it gnawed at me, a cruel trick of fate. Or maybe I thought fate wasn't cruel at all. Maybe it was deliberate. The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. Mr. Moreau appeared in the doorway, his linen shirt fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. "Up early," he said, carrying 2 cups of espresso. "That's a good sign. The artists who wake early are the ones who still believe in change." I smiled, accepting the cup. "And the ones who can't sleep," he chuckled. "They're the ones already changing." We sat quietly for a moment, listening to the fountain. The water's rhythm reminded me of the ocean, the one I used to photograph when I couldn't face people. "I saw the announcement," I said finally. "About the exhibit." "Ah, yes," he replied, his eyes lighting. "The Evening of Light. A tradition older than this villa itself. Each artist shows one piece, something that captures what they found here. And what if what they found isn't beautiful?" He leaned back, thoughtful. "Then show the truth. Light belongs to truth, first, beauty second." His words settled over me like a gentle command. Later that day, I walked through the village, camera in hand. The cobblestones were slick with dew, and the scent of baking bread trailed through the narrow streets. I stopped at a cafe by the square. The owner, a woman named Isabel, waved from behind the counter. She'd become a familiar face, the kind of person who always remembered how you liked your coffee and asked questions only when she sensed you wanted to talk. "You look far away today," she said, pouring a cappuccino. "I'm thinking about my sister," I admitted. "She's getting married soon." Isabel smiled, setting down the cup. "You must be happy for her." "I'm trying to be," I said. She studied me for a moment. "Sometimes being happy for someone else means forgiving what they didn't know they broke." I didn't answer. I just stirred my coffee and watched the foam dissolve. Back at the villa, the other residents were busy preparing for the exhibit, painters arguing over colors, writers reading lines aloud under the olive trees. There was energy in the air, creative and contagious. I wanted to feel it too, but something inside me resisted. Every photo I took looked beautiful, but hollow. That night, Ethan called from Los Angeles. His voice was a soft hum through the static. "So how's the French countryside treating you?" "It's quiet," I said, tracing circles on the table. "I think I'm supposed to be finding peace, but some days it feels like I'm just rearranging my pain." "Maybe that's part of it," he said. "Peace doesn't erase pain. It just changes where you set it down." He had a way of making everything sound simple, though nothing about my life had ever been. "I got your email," he added. "About the exhibit. You should send me one of your pieces. Maybe we can use it for the film." "The film?" He laughed. "I didn't tell you I'm working on a short documentary, stories about artists rebuilding after loss. You'd fit right in." "Ethan, don't say no yet," he interrupted gently. "Just think about it." I promised I would, though I already knew the idea terrified me. The next morning, I took my camera into the fields. The storm from earlier in the week had left puddles shimmering like small mirrors. I waded through them, photographing reflections, trees, clouds, my own outline warped by the water's surface. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed. When I returned, the courtyard was filled with soft laughter. Mr. Moreau was giving a tour to a small group of visitors. Among them was a tall man with dark hair and a camera around his neck. I recognized him instantly. "Ethan," he turned at the sound of my voice, smiling. "You didn't think I'd stay across an ocean, did you?" I stared, speechless, then laughed. "You said you were in LA. I was," he said, walking toward me, until I realized all my best footage was missing its subject. "Mr. Moreau clapped his hands together. "Ah, so this is the mysterious Ethan, the filmmaker with the wandering heart." Ethan grinned, shaking his hand. Guilty. He spent the afternoon setting up his equipment, filming shots of the villa, the sunlight through the shutters, the lavender fields, even the quiet corners of my studio. I tried to act unaffected, but every time his lens found me, I felt exposed. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, we sat on the terrace with glasses of red wine. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rosemary. "So," he said, turning the camera off, "tell me what this place means to you." I hesitated. "It's somewhere I can breathe." Is that all? I met his eyes. "It's somewhere I stopped waiting to be forgiven." He nodded, understanding. "Then maybe that's what your photo should say." I didn't answer. The sky was fading into shades of violet and gold, and the moment felt too fragile to fill with words. Later, when he left to pack up, I stayed on the terrace, the glass of wine untouched beside me. The valley was drenched in twilight, the air humming with crickets. I thought about Grace, about her walking down that aisle under string lights, everyone watching her smile. The image hurt, but not in the way it used to. It hurt like something healing. I turned to my camera, adjusted the focus, and took a picture of the empty chair across from me. The light wrapped around it, softly golden and forgiving. When I looked at the photo, I saw it, the thing I'd been chasing since I arrived. Stillness. Not the kind that traps you, but the kind that frees you. I named the image Grace. That night I dreamed of the lavender fields in full bloom. In the dream, I walked through them barefoot, the air thick with color, and for the first time there were no shadows following me. When I woke, dawn was just breaking, pale pink spilling across the walls. I reached for my notebook and wrote one sentence before I forgot it. Some wounds don't close because they were meant to become windows. I didn't know what the next chapter of my life would look like, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of the light. The first days of April arrived with sunlight, so soft it felt almost unreal. Provence was waking up again, lavender buds just beginning to hint at purple olive trees, shaking off the last chill of winter. I spent my mornings walking through the fields, barefoot, the earth damp and fragrant beneath me. There was a calm in my chest I hadn't known in years, a kind of quiet that didn't demand anything. For once I wasn't running from my past, I was simply existing outside it. Each afternoon I worked in the studio developing prints for the May exhibit. The walls were covered now, images of light spilling through windows, raindrops clinging to glass faces half turned toward the Sunday. They weren't beautiful in the traditional sense, but they were honest. I could finally look at them and see myself. One morning Mr. Moreau appeared at my door with a stack of papers in his hand. "I have news," he said, his voice bright. "The residency has chosen its feature artists for the exhibition. You are one of them." I blinked, surprised. "Me?" He nodded, handing me a printed schedule. "Your showcase will open the same day as the Evening of Light, May 21st. A good day for beginnings." The words hung in the air like smoke. May 21st. I stared at the date, pulse quickening. My throat went dry. Mr. Moreau didn't notice. "You'll have the courtyard at dusk. The light there is perfect." I forced a smile. "Perfect," I echoed. When he left, I sat in silence, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. That date, Grace's wedding. Of all days in the year, it had to be that one. I set the paper down and leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. The universe had a dark sense of humor. Outside wind moved through the cypress trees, their shadows swaying across the walls. I could almost hear my mother's voice in the rustle clip, deliberate. "You always make everything about you, Olivia." Maybe this time I thought I finally would. That evening, Ethan arrived from Los Angeles. He showed up at the villa just as the sun began to dip, his camera bag slung over one shoulder and that same quiet smile on his face. "You didn't tell me you got featured," he said as he stepped into the studio. "I didn't think it mattered." "Liv," he said gently, "it matters." He looked around the room, taking in the photographs pinned to the walls. "You've changed your light," he said softly. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not hiding behind it anymore." I didn't know how to answer that, so I didn't. We worked in silence for a while, him adjusting his camera. For the short film, he was still shooting me arranging prints into a sequence. At some point, he said, "You okay? You've been quiet." "The exhibit is on May 21st, I said. He stopped mid-motion. "Grace's wedding." I nodded. He leaned against the table thinking, maybe it's not a coincidence. I laughed bitterly. "You think the universe scheduled this just for irony?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's giving you a chance to rewrite the day." I looked at him uncertain. "Rewrite it how?" "As yours," he said simply. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, the moonlight spilling across the floor. I opened my laptop and scrolled through old photos, family dinners, birthdays, the years before everything cracked. Then I reached the ones I'd taken after I'd moved out, cold, professional, perfect. The more polished my work became, the emptier I'd felt. I closed the laptop and reached for my notebook. On the first blank page I wrote, "Same day, same world, different kind of love." The next morning I found Mr. Moreau in the dark room, his sleeves rolled up, a faint hum in his throat as he worked. "You look troubled," he said without turning. "I just realized the exhibition date matches my sister's wedding." He smiled, eyes still focused on the developing tray. "Ah, 2 celebrations then." I laughed softly. "If you can call it that." He finally looked up at me. "My wife once told me that grief and creation are twins. Her first art show opened the same day her father died. She said it made her understand that loss gives shape to light." "Do you think this is meant to happen?" I asked. He shrugged gently. "The universe keeps handing us the same dates until we write them right." His words followed me all day. By afternoon I found myself out in the village square, photographing the market, bursts of color, laughter, music. The energy was alive, nothing like the still perfection my mother always curated. I bought a small bundle of lavender from a woman with silver hair. She tied it with twine and said, "For luck." When I returned to the villa, Ethan was reviewing footage on his laptop. "You've got that look," he said. "The one that means you've decided something." "I think I'm going to make the exhibition about silence," I said. He raised a brow. "Silence, not the kind they gave me. The kind I chose." He smiled. "Now that I want to film." For the next few weeks, we worked side by side. I photographed everything that breathed in between moments, the way wind bent the lavender, the light pooling at the bottom of a wine glass, Ethan's shadow crossing mine on the terrace. He filmed it all quietly, never telling me what he'd use. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the hills, he found me standing in the courtyard, staring at the space where my photographs would soon hang. "You look like you're about to walk into battle," he said. "Maybe I am," I murmured. "It's strange. I used to dream about going to my sister's wedding, proving I was happy without them. Now I don't need to." Ethan tilted his head. "That's not revenge, Liv. That's peace." I smiled faintly. Maybe they're not that different after all. He walked closer. "They are. Revenge is about being seen. Peace is about seeing clearly." The sky deepened to indigo as he said it. I looked at him and realized he wasn't talking about my family anymore. That night, I stayed up printing photos until dawn. Each image felt like a heartbeat. When I finished, I stood in the quiet room, surrounded by faces, reflections, bits of sky and water. It wasn't a story about them anymore. It was about me, about all the places I'd learned to exist unseen. The next morning, the air was cool and sweet. Mr. Moreau walked in carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. "For the table at your exhibit," he said. "Every artist needs a little chaos beside their order." I laughed. "Thank you." He lingered, studying the prints on the wall. "You found your light," he said softly. I followed his gaze. "I think it found me." As he left, he paused in the doorway. "When the 21st comes, don't think of it as her day or yours. Think of it as the universe holding 2 mirrors up to the same Sunday." After he left, I opened the window. The scent of jasmine floated in. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour. I sat at the desk and began writing labels for each photograph. Independence. The weight of silence. Becoming. When I reached the final one, a self-portrait I'd taken in the rain, I hesitated. Then I wrote forgiven. That night, Ethan joined me on the terrace. We shared a bottle of wine as the sky turned soft and blue. He lifted his glass. To May 21st, I raised mine. To rewriting what it means. We drank quietly, the sound of cicadas filling the air. Later, when he walked me back to my door, I caught a glimpse of myself, reflected in the glass hair, loose eyes steady, the faintest smile. For the first time, I didn't see the woman who'd been excluded. I saw someone standing exactly where she was meant to be. Outside, the night stretched endless and full of promise. I whispered to no one, let the light fall where it may. The wind moved through the lavender, soft and certain as if the world itself had just agreed. The morning began with thunder rolling far in the distance, the kind that made the villa windows tremble before the rain ever arrived. I woke to that sound, the low hum of something shifting inside me. The exhibit was over, the guests gone, and yet my mind was still alive with it, the way people had stood in front of my photographs and seen themselves in my silence. The world had turned that moment into something larger than I ever intended, and I could feel it gathering outside my walls like a storm. I made coffee, sat by the window, and scrolled through my inbox. Hundreds of messages waited, subject lines blurred together, interview request, licensing rights, press feature. My story, or what people thought was my story, was spreading faster than I could control. Ethan had warned me this might happen, but nothing prepares you for being reduced to a headline. By noon, my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. "You should probably take it," Ethan said from across the table, glancing up from his laptop. "It's not going to stop until you do," I answered on the third ring. "This is Olivia." "Hi, miss." "Hart," said a brisk female voice. "I'm calling from the Morning Ledger. We're running a feature on your exhibit, The Weight of Silence. There's enormous public interest in your connection to the viral video that's been circulating. Would you be open to a quick statement about your family's reaction?" My throat tightened. "There's no statement," I said. She hesitated. "The public's already speculating, Miss Hart. Wouldn't it be better to—" I hung up before she could finish. Ethan looked at me over his screen. "You okay? They're not asking about the art. They're asking about the pain," I said quietly. "They want to see how deep it goes." He came around the table and rested a hand on my shoulder. "Then don't feed it. You don't owe them your wounds." But I wasn't angry at the world for being curious. I was angry that it still surprised me how easily pain became a performance once the audience showed up. That afternoon, the storm finally broke. Rain lashed against the villa's shutters, wind sweeping through the olive trees. I tried to work but couldn't. My thoughts were loud again, memories, words, old versions of myself. I opened my laptop almost without thinking and pulled up the folder of family photos I'd avoided for months. There we were, my parents, Grace, and me, standing in front of our childhood home in Washington. My mother's hand rested on Grace's shoulder, not mine. I zoomed in, studying my own face, the forced smile, the tension around my mouth. Even at 12, I'd already learned how to take up less space. Ethan appeared in the doorway, silent for a long moment before saying, "You're torturing yourself." "I just wanted to see if I remember her right," I said. "The version of her that existed before the judgment started." "Do you know?" I said honestly. "I think I only remember the distance." He crossed the room, sitting beside me. "Maybe it's time to stop remembering her and start remembering you." I turned to him. "And who's that supposed to be?" "The woman who turned survival into something beautiful," he said. "The woman who created peace out of everything they took from her." I wanted to believe him. I really did. Later that night, we sat on the terrace, the air still damp from the rain. Ethan had brought his camera to review the footage from the exhibit. The light from his laptop flickered across his face as he watched. "You should see this," he said. On the screen was a clip I hadn't realized he'd filmed me speaking to a small crowd at the end of the exhibition. My voice trembled at first, then steadied. "For years I thought silence meant defeat," I heard myself saying. "But sometimes silence is the sound of self-respect. Sometimes it's what you do when you finally stop performing for love." The crowd had gone completely still after that. Ethan paused the video looking at me. "You know what that is?" he asked. "What freedom?" "You can hear it in your voice." I stared at the frozen image of myself on the screen, the faintest smile caught mid-frame. "I don't know if it's freedom," I said, "but it's something that doesn't hurt anymore." He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "That's what peace is, Liv. It's just the absence of pain." The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the sky washed clean. I decided to walk to the village, needing air movement, something ordinary. The streets were slick, the air sharp with petrichor. I passed by the bakery where Isabel, the owner, waved from behind the counter. "Everyone's talking about your exhibition," she called out. "You've made this town famous." I laughed softly. "I think they'd prefer to stay quiet." She smiled knowingly. "Maybe, but quiet places need loud hearts." Her words stayed with me as I walked back to the villa. There was truth in them, the kind of truth that comes from living, not explaining. That afternoon the inevitable happened. My phone lit up with my mother's name. For a moment I just stared at it the way you might stare at an open flame, knowing the burn is coming. "Are you going to answer?" Ethan asked, gently. "I don't know. She'll say what she always says. That you've embarrassed her, that you've misunderstood." I sighed. Then maybe she needs to hear silence for once. The phone rang until it stopped. Seconds later, a text arrived. "Your choices have consequences, Olivia. You've made a fool of yourself. And of us." I read it twice before setting the phone down. My pulse was steady, surprisingly calm. "She doesn't realize she's proving the point," I said aloud. Ethan came to stand beside me. "You don't have to reply." "I won't," I said. "But she'll hear me anyway." He frowned. How I smiled faintly. Through the quiet, that night while the villa slept, I went down to the terrace with my camera. The moon hung low, casting silver across the sea. I adjusted the lens, framing the horizon, and pressed the shutter. The click echoed through the dark, a small, defiant sound. In the morning I looked at the photo. The sea shimmered under moonlight, infinite, untamed. No people, no symbols, just light finding its way through darkness. I printed it, framed it, and wrote one word beneath it: peace. By evening, that image would become part of something I didn't see coming, the spark that turned private healing into public fire. Ethan had uploaded a small clip from the exhibit the night before my speech about silence. It was already spreading online, shared thousands of times, climbing toward millions. When he told me, I felt both weightless and terrified. "Ethan," I whispered, "they're going to know." He looked at me calmly. "Let them. It's not a secret anymore. It's a truth." The sun was setting over the hills, then the sky burning gold and rose. I walked outside, feeling the wind against my face, and whispered to no one. If they wanted me silent, they should have taught me peace instead of fear. The words weren't meant for the world, but somehow the world was already listening. The morning after the exhibit felt unreal. I woke to sunlight cutting across the sheets, golden and sharp, the kind that makes the world look brand new. For a moment, I didn't remember what day it was, or why my phone wouldn't stop buzzing on the nightstand. Then the memory came back. Ethan had uploaded the short video from the event, a quiet 3-minute piece of me speaking under the archway as the crowd clapped. I hadn't even known he'd recorded that part. I reached for the phone, still half asleep, and froze. Notifications were flooding in faster than I could clear them. Mentions, comments, shares. Thousands of them. The video had gone viral overnight. Ethan appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee, his hair still messy from sleep. "Morning celebrity," he said, his grin crooked. I sat up slowly. "What are you talking about?" He handed me a mug and turned his phone toward me. On the screen was the video, my voice echoing softly through the villa courtyard, the words I barely remembered saying, "Sometimes not showing up is how you finally arrive." Below the video were numbers that didn't make sense. Views climbing into the millions, hearts flashing across the screen. Comments poured in from everywhere. This hit me right in the chest. I needed to hear this today. "Who is this woman?" I blinked. "Ethan, this can't be real." "It's real," he said. "People heard you." I watched the clip again. The golden light over the villa, the tremor in my voice, the way the crowd had gone completely silent when I said the word silence. It was beautiful, yes, but it felt strange seeing myself through a stranger's lens, as if the woman on the screen had already stepped beyond me. A new notification appeared. "You've been featured," Ethan said, reading it before I could. "Look, New York Lifestyle, Vogue Online, even some French magazine picked it up. They're calling you the photographer who turned silence into art." I laughed, disbelief spilling out like air. "That's ridiculous." He looked at me seriously. "It's poetic. And true." I scrolled further down and saw a tweet with the headline, "Forgotten Sister Finds Her Light." Beneath it, someone had linked to my family's old group photo from years ago. The internet had already found the story. My stomach tightened. "Oh no," I whispered. "They're making it about them." "Let them," Ethan said. "You told your truth. The rest isn't yours to control." But control had always been what my family valued most. By midday, journalists had begun reaching out. My inbox overflowed with interview requests, collaboration offers, invitations to exhibits. Even a Paris gallery wanted to feature my work. For the first time in my life, opportunity didn't feel like survival, it felt like recognition. And yet beneath it all, a dread began to form. That afternoon, while Ethan was on a call, my phone rang again. The name on the screen made my breath hitch. Mom. For a second, I considered answering. Then I remembered the last voicemail she'd left before I left Portland. Cold measured, warning me that running away doesn't fix what's broken. I let the phone ring until it stopped. Moments later, a message appeared. "What have you done? People are calling. You've humiliated this family." I stared at it for a long time. Then I locked the screen and turned the phone face down. The sunlight felt colder now. Ethan found me hours later, sitting in the garden, camera in my lap. "You got her message," he said quietly. I nodded. "She thinks I did this to spite her." He crouched beside me. "Did you?" I looked up at him. "No, but she'll never believe that." He sighed. "You don't have to fix her understanding of you, Liv." "I know," I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing, "but some part of me still wants her to see what I meant to see me." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "The ones who refuse to look won't see, no matter how bright the light gets." By evening, the story had spread across the Atlantic. My face appeared on blogs, Instagram reels, even local news sites back in the States. The captions varied, some celebrated, some dissected. Photographer's viral speech redefines family and forgiveness. Estranged daughter's art exposes generational wounds. Each headline felt like a mirror I hadn't agreed to hold. Later that night, Ethan called from across the villa. "You need to see this." I walked into his workspace, heart pounding. On his laptop screen, an American morning show was playing. My mother sat in a studio, her hair perfectly styled, her voice steady. "My family has been misrepresented," she said. "People forget there are two sides to every story. We love Olivia, but she's always been emotional. Sometimes creative people turn pain into performance." I couldn't breathe. Ethan muted the video. "I'm sorry, Liv." I sank into a chair, staring at my hands. "She's doing damage control. She's always been better at that than loving me." Ethan hesitated. "Do you want to respond?" I shook my head. "No. The truth doesn't need to shout." But the noise outside was growing louder. The next morning, my name was trending. Hashtags like #SilenceSpeaks and #LetOliviaBe flooded Twitter. People shared their own stories under my daughter's sister's women who'd been told to stay quiet. One woman wrote, "I haven't spoken to my mother in 20 years. Watching her video made me feel seen." I scrolled through them until my eyes blurred with tears. It wasn't about fame. It was about echo. Somehow my silence had become a voice for all of us. That night, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't my mother. It was Grace. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. Then I answered. Liv, her voice trembled slightly. "I saw it. I saw everything." I closed my eyes. "You don't have to pick sides." "I'm not calling to," she said quickly. "I just wanted to tell you. You looked peaceful. Happier than I've ever seen you." The lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "Thank you. I wish I could have been there," she said softly. "Mom says you embarrassed her, but maybe that's what truth does." I didn't know what to say. For the first time, she sounded like the sister I used to know, the one before all the lines were drawn. After we hung up, I walked outside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. Above the hills, the stars looked impossibly close. Ethan joined me, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like my silence isn't mine anymore," I said. "It belongs to everyone now," he smiled. "Then let them hear what peace sounds like." I looked out at the dark horizon, the faint shimmer of the Mediterranean in the distance. My camera hung at my side, but for once I didn't lift it. The next morning, Ethan found me in the courtyard, barefoot, reading the comments aloud. "Listen to this one," I said. She wrote, "I never knew silence could be healing until I saw hers." He grinned. "You see, you didn't start a scandal. You started a movement." I laughed softly. I didn't even mean to start anything. He reached for my hand. The best revolutions never mean to. As the sun rose higher, turning the fields gold, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of my mother's disapproval, not of what people might think. The story had already outgrown me. The light was enough. Later, when the journalists called again asking for interviews, I said yes to one. Not to defend myself, but to reclaim my voice before someone else decided what it sounded like. The woman on the other end asked, "Why do you think your video resonated with so many people?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Because silence," I said, "isn't empty. It's just waiting for someone brave enough to listen." When the call ended, I stood by the window watching the wind move through the lavender fields. My phone buzzed again, dozens of new messages lighting up the screen. For once, I didn't open any of them. Instead, I stepped outside, closed my eyes, and let the quiet fold around me. The world, loud and chaotic, could say whatever it wanted. I'd already said enough. The interview aired on a Thursday morning. I hadn't planned to watch it, but Ethan had left the television on in the background while making coffee. My name floated through the air like a question, and then my mother's face appeared on the screen. Perfect posture, polished smile, the same beige blazer she wore to every public event. "Mrs. Hart, how do you respond to your daughter's viral video?" the anchor asked, leaning forward with mock sympathy. Mom smiled tightly. "It's been taken out of context," she said. "Families have disagreements. Unfortunately, social media tends to dramatize what should remain private." Her tone was warm but rehearsed, like a woman who'd practiced her grief in a mirror. Ethan muted the sound. "You don't have to see this," he said, "but I did." He hesitated, then turned the volume back on. "We love Olivia, my mother," continued her voice, quivering just enough to sound sincere, "but she's always been artistic. She feels things deeply, sometimes too deeply." My chest tightened. I could hear the subtext in every word, that familiar dance between concern and condemnation. She was trying to rewrite me again, turning emotion into instability. "She's trying to sound gracious," Ethan said carefully, "but it's the same manipulation dressed up in empathy." On-screen Mom gave a small, rueful smile. "I just hope one day she remembers we're family." The anchor nodded solemnly, and the camera panned out as the segment ended. Ethan turned off the TV. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything. "She's not talking to the public," I said quietly. "She's talking to me." He put down the remote. "Then don't answer her in the same language. She only speaks reputation. You speak truth." I wanted to believe that, but the line between the two had blurred. By noon, the internet was on fire again. Clips from the interview spread across every platform, her soft voice, her carefully chosen words. But something unexpected happened. People didn't buy it. The comment sections filled with anger. "Classic guilt trip. This woman sounds like she's been rehearsing manipulation her whole life. She's trying to paint herself as the victim." A journalist tweeted, "It's amazing how quickly family love becomes PR when power is threatened." By evening number, Let Olivia Be was trending again. I scrolled through it all in disbelief. I hadn't said a word, but the truth was fighting for me anyway. Still, I couldn't celebrate. Because beneath the anger there was something sad, strangers dissecting our pain like entertainment. My silence had freed me, but now it was feeding a spectacle. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from Grace. "Are you okay? I saw Mom's interview." "I'm fine," I wrote back. "You don't have to take sides." Her reply came quickly. "I already did live. I just didn't realize it until now." I stared at the message for a long time. The next day, a letter arrived from a law firm in Seattle. Maggie Lopez, my attorney, had forwarded it with a note. "They're testing the waters. Don't panic." The letter was formal, cold. My mother, through her lawyer, was threatening a defamation claim for misrepresentation of private family matters. I laughed out loud when I read it, a sound halfway between disbelief and exhaustion. Ethan found me sitting at the kitchen table, the letter in my hand. "They're really going through with it," I said. He read over my shoulder, jaw tightening. "This isn't about money. It's control." "Of course it is," I said. "It always was." "What do you want to do?" I looked out the window. The lavender fields swayed gently in the breeze, completely indifferent to the chaos I was drowning in. "I'll fight," I said finally. "But not for revenge. For peace." 2 days later, the news broke: the Hart family feud lawsuit looms over viral video. The same networks that had once celebrated my story now circled it like vultures. Reporters called me the defiant daughter, the artist of estrangement. I had become a narrative instead of a person. I agreed to one interview not to defend myself but to reclaim the tone. It was the same show where Mom had spoken. When I arrived at the studio in Paris, the host greeted me warmly, her eyes soft with curiosity. "Olivia," she began, "your mother said she feels misunderstood. What would you like to say to her?" I took a breath, keeping my hands folded in my lap. "That misunderstanding isn't new. It's been our family's language for years." I just stopped speaking it. The host nodded slowly. "Are you angry?" "No," I said. "I'm free. Anger ties you to the people who hurt you. Silence frees you from them. And do you forgive her?" I thought about that for a moment, then smiled faintly. Forgiveness isn't a gift you hand someone else. It's when you stop living as the villain they wrote you to be. The studio went quiet. Even the cameraman paused. When the episode aired, it was shared millions of times. But this time, the story didn't twist. It felt whole. Back in Seattle, the reaction was immediate. My mother's PR team released another statement claiming mutual love and respect remain within the Hart family. But the damage to her image was already done. Sponsors from her charity events quietly withdrew, and one local paper ran the headline, "The Price of Pretending." Grace called that night. Her voice was softer, uncertain. "She's falling apart, Liv. I don't even know what to say to her." "Then don't," I said gently. "You don't owe her the comfort of pretending anymore." Grace exhaled shakily. "She keeps saying you humiliated us. Maybe humiliation is what happens when the mask finally falls off." There was a long silence. Then Grace whispered, "You sound calm." "I am," I said. "For the first time in my life, I'm not performing for her approval." After we hung up, I went to the terrace. The air was cool, heavy with night. Ethan joined me, setting down 2 glasses of wine. "You handled that interview perfectly," he said. "I just told the truth." "Which is exactly why she can't fight you anymore," he said. "The truth doesn't flinch." I looked out at the moonlight, spilling over the fields. "I used to think justice would look like an apology," I said. "Now I think it looks like peace." He smiled, lifting his glass. "To peace, then." I clinked mine against his. "And to finally being done with secrets." The next morning, news of the potential lawsuit spread even further. My mother was photographed leaving her lawyer's office, expression tight and brittle. The headline shifted again: "Mother versus daughter, the silence that split a family." But what none of them understood was that silence hadn't split us. It had protected me long enough to rebuild. Later that week, Maggie called. "They're hesitating," she said. "Public opinion's not in their favor." she might drop it. Good, I said. Let her. And if she doesn't, then I'll show up, I said. For once on my own terms. After the call, I turned off my phone and stepped outside. The day was still, the sky streaked with gold. I picked up my camera and took a picture of the horizon. No subjects, no faces, just light stretching endlessly forward. Ethan appeared behind me, his voice soft. What do you see, Balance? I said. For the first time, everything's exactly where it belongs. That evening, I wrote in my journal, reputation is what they build around your silence. Truth is what survives after you stop protecting their comfort. I closed the notebook, feeling the weight lift from my chest. Tomorrow would bring lawyers' statements, headlines, but for now, the world was quiet again. And in that quiet, I knew I'd already won. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and rain. Outside, the sky over Marseille hung heavy and gray, the kind of light that made everything look sharper than it should. Ethan squeezed my hand as we stepped out of the car, the sound of cameras clicking already filling the air. Reporters lined the steps shouting, questions, flashes exploding like fireworks. Miss Hart, is it true your mother's suing for defamation? Do you have anything to say? I kept walking. Maggie Lopez, my attorney, walked ahead, her black umbrella tilted against the drizzle. Don't answer, she said quietly. Let them photograph peace. It scares them more than anger. Inside, the marble floors gleamed, each step echoing like punctuation. My mother sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, her posture perfect as always. She wore a cream suit, pearls at her neck, her hair twisted into the same immaculate chignon she'd worn since I was a teenager. Dad sat beside her, expression vacant, as though he were somewhere else entirely. Grace wasn't there. The bailiff called for silence and the room stilled. My heart pounded, but not from fear, from finality. This was the last conversation our family would ever have, and it wouldn't even involve words between us. The opposing attorney stood first, tall, silver-haired, practiced in the art of polite destruction. Your Honor, he began, this case is about reputation. It is about a daughter who used her family's private life as a tool for personal gain, presenting her parents in a false and damaging light to millions. Maggie rose before he finished. Correction, Your Honor, this case is about a daughter telling the truth. If the truth damages reputations, perhaps it wasn't the daughter who caused the harm. A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. My mother's jaw tightened. The attorney clicked a remote, and suddenly, my wedding video filled the projection screen. The image of me standing beneath the Sicilian arch appeared, sunlight spilling across my dress. My voice, the one I'd barely recognized, filled the room. Sometimes not showing up is how you finally arrive. The courtroom watched in silence. When the clip ended, the attorney turned back to the judge. This video, seen by over 20 million people, was presented as a statement of independence. But in doing so, it implied cruelty, exclusion, and abuse, all without evidence. Maggie stood again. The evidence is in the mother's own words, she said, flipping a page. A text message sent in a family group chat, and I quote, "Hope she doesn't show up to her sister's wedding." Gasps moved through the spectators. My mother's face remained frozen, though a flush crept up her neck. That message, Maggie continued, was not fabricated. It was not staged. It was her truth. And the moment my client stopped protecting the comfort of others and started honoring herself, the judge raised a hand. Let's stick to relevant claims. Of course, Your Honor, Maggie said, calm as ever. The plaintiff alleges defamation. But my client has not profited from her story. She did not sell it, did not brand, it did not monetize it. Her silence spoke, the world simply chose to listen. The attorney countered quickly. Her so-called silence has destroyed reputations. Mrs. Hart can no longer maintain her charitable board positions. Sponsors have withdrawn. That's measurable damage. Maggie turned to the judge. What my colleague calls damage, I call consequence. The truth is not defamation just because it's inconvenient. For a moment, no one spoke. The judge scribbled a note, then looked toward my mother. Mrs. Hart, you may testify. She stood smoothing her skirt before walking to the stand. When she spoke, her voice was steady, almost tender. "Your Honor, I love my daughter. I always have. But she's portrayed me as some kind of villain. People online have sent me threats. They've called me names I can't even repeat. I've been humiliated for loving her too much. Loving her too much." The phrase twisted in my stomach. Maggie approached the witness stand. "Mrs. Hart, do you deny sending the message instructing your daughter not to attend her sister's wedding?" Mom hesitated. "It was poorly worded. It said, 'Hope she doesn't show up,'" Maggie pressed. "What did you mean exactly?" Mom's lips trembled slightly. "I was angry that day. Families fight, but that doesn't justify turning us into a public spectacle." Maggie's tone softened, almost kind. "Maybe your daughter didn't turn you into a spectacle. Maybe she just stopped hiding what was already there." The judge leaned back in his chair. "I've heard enough," he said. "Both parties have expressed their positions clearly. I'll review the evidence and deliver my verdict shortly." As the court recessed, Mom avoided my gaze. Dad finally looked at me, his eyes tired, almost sorry. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but he didn't. He just nodded once, barely perceptible, and looked away. Ethan touched my hand. "You okay?" "I think so," I whispered. "It's strange. I thought this would feel like war. It feels more like a funeral." When the judge returned, the room went still again. He cleared his throat, flipping through the case file. After reviewing the claims, the evidence, and the content of the public materials in question, this court finds no legal basis for defamation. Miss Hart's work constitutes personal expression. Case dismissed. The gavel struck wood. The sound echoed like thunder. It was over. Mom's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't move. Dad stood first quietly, placing a hand on her back, a gesture that was more habit than affection. Reporters immediately rushed from the benches, the air filling with whispers. Maggie turned to me, smiling softly. "You did it." I shook my head. No, the truth did. Outside, the rain had stopped. The courtyard glistened under a thin veil of light. Flashbulbs popped as soon as we stepped through the doors. "Olivia, how does it feel to win?" someone shouted. I stopped at the top of the steps, lifting my face toward the gray sky. "Some stories don't need winners," I said. "Only endings." The reporters went silent for a beat, cameras still clicking. Then Ethan led me through the crowd to the waiting car. As we drove away, I looked back once. My mother was still standing on the courthouse steps alone. No umbrella this time. The rain had left her hair damp, her face unreadable. Ethan followed my gaze. "Do you want to go to her?" I shook my head. "No. I already said everything I needed to." He nodded, understanding. The city blurred past the windows, reflections of streetlights flickering like tiny ghosts. That night, back at the villa, I sat by the open window. The air smelled of wet earth and jasmine. I could still hear the sound of the gavel in my head, final, absolute. I wasn't sure if it was justice or mercy, but it was closure. Ethan joined me, 2 mugs of tea in hand. "Maggie said the press is calling this a victory for truth," he said. "They want you to give a statement." I smiled faintly. "Let them write what they want. I've said enough." He placed the mug beside me. "You're allowed to rest now." I looked out at the dark horizon. Maybe resting is the bravest thing I'll ever do. He reached for my hand. "Then rest." I leaned my head against his shoulder, the night humming softly around us. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small or invisible or wrong. I felt whole. Down the hill, the lights of the village shimmered against the sea, and I whispered into the quiet, "This is what freedom sounds like." The wind carried it away, soft and certain, and the world didn't argue back. The days after the trial passed like the slow exhale after a long storm. The press eventually moved on, hungry for fresher scandals, and the quiet that followed felt almost foreign. I returned to the villa, to my studio overlooking the olive groves, where the walls still smelled faintly of paper, ink, and rain. Every morning the same light poured through the window, soft, golden, forgiving, and each time it fell across my desk, I felt something inside me settle. I hadn't heard from my parents since the verdict. Not a word, not even a message from Grace. The silence between us had grown into something massive, stretching across continents and time zones. But unlike before, it didn't suffocate me. It gave me room to breathe. I spent my mornings developing new prints, the kind that didn't need to be perfect. The images were quieter, now blurred edges, uneven light moments caught mid-breath. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I was chasing truth. Ethan had started editing the final cut of the documentary he'd filmed over the past year, Love Over Fear. It wasn't about me, not entirely. It was about artists who had turned their pain into creation. Still, every frame of Sicily, every shot of my face in the light, seemed to pulse with the same heartbeat. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, I found him outside on the terrace, laptop open, headphones on. The soft glow from the screen reflected in his eyes. "What are you working on now?" I asked, setting down a glass of wine beside him. He smiled. "The ending. Does it have one yet?" He removed his headphones, considering. "Not really. I don't think endings exist. Just transformations." I liked that. Transformations. It sounded gentler than closure. We watched the sunset in silence, the air cool and heavy with the scent of lavender. The horizon looked endless, but for the first time I didn't need to chase it. The next morning my inbox was full again. Not from journalists this time, but from strangers' letters, from people around the world who had watched the trial, the interview, the video. Women mostly. Daughters, sisters, wives. Each one a reflection of a wound I'd once thought was mine alone. I left my mother's house after 30 years of silence. Your story gave me courage. I watched your video with my daughter. We cried together. Thank you for showing us that peace doesn't have to look like forgiveness. I read every message, tears blurring the screen. It hit me then, my revenge had never been loud or cruel. It had been healing. The kind that doesn't destroy. It rebuilds what was taken. Later that week, a knock echoed through the villa. I wiped my hands on a cloth and opened the door. Grace stood there. Her hair was shorter, her eyes softer, her posture uncertain. She held a small bouquet of wild jasmine in her hands. My mother's favorite flower once before it became mine. "Hi," she said quietly. "I didn't move for a moment. You came all the way here." She nodded. "I needed to." I stepped aside. "Come in." She looked around the villa, taking in the light, the warmth, the stillness. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's peaceful," I replied. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd once sorted through old photos and tears. She placed the jasmine between us. The scent filled the room, soft and sharp, all at once. "I saw the trial," she said finally. "Mom hasn't stopped talking about it. She's quieter now. Not humble, just tired." "She'll survive," I said, trying to sound indifferent. Grace met my eyes. "I think she already has, but she's not the same. Neither am I." There was a pause. Then she said, almost a whisper, "I'm sorry, Liv. For not standing up for you. For pretending it was easier to stay neutral." I looked at her for a long moment. "You were surviving too," I said. "We both were." Her shoulders slumped, relief flickering through her face. "She blames you for everything, but she also misses you." I let out a breath. That's her pattern. Control, then regret. Over and over. Grace nodded. "I know. I used to think if I stayed good enough, obedient enough, I could make her love both of us equally." "Did it work?" She smiled faintly. "Not even close." We laughed softly, and it felt like breathing for the first time in years. For the next few hours, we talked not about our mother, not about the wedding, but about the small things. The food in Provence, the colors in the fields, how Ethan still left his shoes in the wrong place. The kind of conversation that lives in the space where resentment used to be. As the sun dipped behind the hills, she stood to leave. "Will you ever come home?" she asked. I looked out the window toward the lavender fields glowing in the twilight. "I think I already am." She smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "Then maybe I'll visit more often." I nodded. "You should. Bring fewer regrets next time." She hugged me tightly before stepping into the evening light. I watched her walk down the path until she disappeared behind the olive trees. That night, Ethan found me sitting on the terrace, camera in hand. "You okay?" he asked. "I think I forgave her," I said quietly. "Grace, her too. But mostly myself." He smiled. "That's the hardest one." We sat there together, the stars blooming above us. For the first time, the silence between me and my family didn't feel like exile. It felt like distance, safe, necessary, deserved. Weeks passed. The documentary premiered online, and within days it exploded. People called it a love letter to resilience. In one scene, Ethan had used a clip of me standing in the lavender fields, the wind in my hair, eyes closed, smiling faintly. His voice narrated over it. "Some wounds don't close because they were never meant to. They were meant to let the light in." When I watched it, I cried. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't anymore. The world kept moving the way it always does. The noise faded. The opinions quieted. But the peace remained. Sometimes I still caught myself scrolling through the old messages from my mother, that clipped tone, those polished commands disguised as care. I didn't delete them. They were reminders not of who she was, but of who I no longer needed to be. On the last day of spring, I returned to the same field where Ethan had filmed me a year before. The lavender was in bloom and the air buzzed with life. I raised my camera and took a photo of the horizon. No faces, no perfection, just light stretching endlessly forward. As I lowered the camera, Ethan's voice called from behind me. "You got the shot?" I turned and smiled. Finally, he walked toward me, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. The wind moved through the fields, carrying the scent of jasmine and rain. "You know," he said, "it's funny how your story started with a message that told you not to show up." I laughed softly. "And ended with me doing exactly that." He kissed my forehead. "That's the best kind of revenge, isn't it?" I nodded. "The quiet kind. The one that doesn't burn everything down, just lets you walk away glowing." The sun dipped low, casting the world in gold. I raised my camera one last time, framing the light. The shutter clicked. And this time, I didn't look at what I'd captured. I already knew. It was freedom. The morning light spilled through the shutters, in long, soft ribbons, brushing across the wooden floor and catching on the silver frame of my camera. Sicily was quiet that day, the kind of quiet that hummed with life instead of loneliness. The air smelled of salt and rosemary, the sea below, whispering against the rocks. It had been a year since the trial, and yet everything around me felt new, unburdened. I stood by the window of the villa, tying my hair back, glancing at the table covered in photographs. Each print told a story. Some were mine, most belonged to the women who'd come to learn here. I'd turned the villa into a creative retreat for artists who needed a place to breathe, to reclaim their voice through light and color. What once saved me was now saving others, one photograph at a time. The courtyard outside was already buzzing softly. My students laughed as they hung linen backdrops between olive trees, adjusting the light with pieces of mirrored glass. A few called out for my opinion, and I answered with a smile. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about presence. Mr. Moreau arrived mid-morning, his linen suit wrinkled, his hands still smelling faintly of paint and coffee. "You've done well, Olivia," he said as he stepped into the courtyard. His eyes twinkled with something like pride. "This place feels alive again." "I just kept what you started," I replied, pouring him tea. He sat on the stone bench looking around. "I'm retiring," he said suddenly, "moving north to my daughter's vineyard. It's time." I looked up surprised. "Retiring," he nodded, smiling softly. "And I want you to take over this villa. As curator, it should belong to someone who knows how to listen to the silence." The words hit me like sunlight breaking through clouds. For a moment I couldn't speak. Then I reached out and took his hand. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself." He squeezed my fingers gently. "The light found you, Olivia. All you did was stop running from it." When he left later that afternoon, the villa felt even more sacred than before. I walked through each room, touching the walls, remembering who I had been when I first arrived here. A woman made of glass, cracked but still holding light. Ethan found me there standing in the main hall, surrounded by years of captured moments. He told me, he said, stepping closer. "You're the new curator." "I still can't believe it," I said. He smiled. "You earned it. Besides, the world could use more places like this, where stories heal instead of hurt." He pulled me toward the terrace where his laptop sat, open sunlight, reflecting off the screen. "Look," he said. The homepage of a film festival blinked across it, Love Over Fear winner Best Documentary on Truth and Transformation. I covered my mouth laughing. "You're serious." "Completely. The documentary's everywhere now. People are writing essays about it. They're calling you the woman who turned silence into art." I laughed again, shaking my head. It still feels strange seeing my name next to something bigger than me. He turned serious. "It's not bigger than you. It's what grew from you." I reached for his hand, squeezing it. "Then I hope it keeps growing." Late that evening, when the villa had gone quiet, I noticed an envelope slipped under the front door. My name written in neat, familiar cursive. No return address, just a faint scent of jasmine clinging to the paper. My heart hesitated before my hands opened it. The letter was short, barely 5 lines. "You were right to leave. I didn't understand until I watched you live. I'm sorry, Mom." For a long time I stood there staring at the words, waiting for anger or relief to rise. Instead, I felt something softer, acceptance. I folded the letter carefully, placed it inside my journal, beside the pressed jasmine petal Grace had brought me months ago, and whispered to the quiet room, "I forgive you." The words didn't echo, they landed gently like rain returning to the earth. The next morning I set up my camera on the terrace, the sea glittering below. The light was golden low, the kind that wrapped itself around everything it touched. I stood in front of the lens and took a single self-portrait. No makeup, no pretense, just me and the light. I titled it, "Still Here." Ethan found me moments later, leaning in the doorway. "You think she'll ever see that photo, maybe," I said. But I didn't take it for her. He walked closer, his hand brushing my shoulder. "Then, who's it for?" "For me," I said simply. "For everyone who had to be silent before they learned how to speak." We spent the afternoon in the garden helping the students hang lanterns for the end-of-season gathering. As dusk fell, the villa glowed with soft amber light. Music drifted in from the courtyard, laughter mixing with the sound of the sea. When it grew dark, Ethan dimmed the lights and projected a short film against the stone wall clips from Love Over Fear. Faces of women from around the world appeared, each one different, each one radiant. Some were crying, some smiling, some just breathing. My voice floated softly through the speakers. For a long time I thought revenge meant proving them wrong. But peace, real peace, doesn't need an audience. It happens quietly in the moment you stop needing to be understood. The crowd fell silent. The lanterns flickered in the breeze. I looked around and saw faces glowing with tears, joy, relief. For once I didn't feel like the subject of the story. I felt like part of something much larger, something circular, unending. Afterward, as the music started again, I slipped away to the terrace. The sea shimmered in the moonlight. Ethan joined me, wrapping his arm around my waist. "You think you'll ever go back?" he asked. "To Seattle, to them?" I looked out at the horizon. "No. I think they'll come to me in their own way. Maybe not in person. Maybe just in understanding." He nodded. "And if they don't?" I smiled. "Then that's their silence to live with, not mine." For a while, neither of us spoke. The waves crashed gently below, steady and sure. Then Ethan said, "You know what I love most about you?" I turned toward him. "What? You never had to destroy anything to rebuild yourself." I laughed softly. "That's because I finally learned sometimes peace is the loudest kind of revenge." The moon rose higher, pale and perfect. Somewhere down in the courtyard, the students began singing. Their voices rose together, untrained but beautiful, echoing across the valley. I leaned into Ethan, whispering, "This is enough." He kissed my hair. It always was. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the sea and laughter blend into one long breath. If you've ever had to walk away to find peace, you'll understand. Some stories don't end with apologies, they end with truth. The kind that doesn't demand forgiveness, only release. So tell me, what did your silence teach you? Because maybe that's where your story begins too. And if this story stayed with you tonight, stay a little longer. Share what you felt in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and let's keep listening together to all the silences that finally learned to speak.